Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Sounds neat, doesn't it? Almost too neat. This is the Kalam Cosmological, argument polished, popularized, and passionately defended by Christian apologist William Lane Craig. It's a favorite among defenders of God as existence. It's tidy, it's intuitive, and it's, well, kind of misleading. Kalam takes us on a cosmic shortcut from the birth of space and time straight to a timeless, immaterial, personal creator. But that shortcut, it's more of a leap. A cosmic long jump over some of the thorniest problems in physics, metaphysics, and even common sense. So in today's video, we're unpacking the Kalam. We'll take it seriously, but not uncritically. We'll ask hard questions about cause and effect, time before time, and why saying God did it doesn't always count as an explanation. Because when it comes to the origins of everything, we don't need a slick syllogism. We need evidence, reasoning, and a healthy dose of philosophical humility. Let's begin.
Craig has formulated the Kalam cosmological argument in slightly different ways in different contexts. The standard formulation that you'll generally see is that the first premise is that everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Right.
The second premise is that the universe began to exist. So the conclusion then being that the universe had a cause. He formulated the first premise to be, if the universe began to exist, it had a cause. Now that is actually a narrower claim, which makes it easier to defend, because some people have objected that, say, particle decays or other quantum processes can occur without causes. And Craig has objected in the past that they're not truly acausal, and even if they are acausal, it doesn't matter because the universe isn't like that. So I think that this second formulation is basically just to avoid any of those issues, that it doesn't matter if there are maybe some things in the universe like quantum processes or atomic decays or whatever that could occur without a cause. It's just that all that matters is that the universe couldn't have begun without a cause. But I just use the older formulation because I think it's typically easier.
Sometimes it's often divided into two stages. This, everyone's familiar with the first stage of whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Mm-hmm. But then there's the second stage where you move from the cause of the universe to God. But I actually think that there's really four distinct stages in the Kalam, and that it's helpful to lay out all four of those stages so that you can actually see what's going on. And I think it's much easier to also see just how high of a hill a defender of the Kalam's got to climb if they want to get the conclusion that they want. And arguably there's a fifth stage, but I'll get there. So the first stage, as I see it, is that they need to claim that the universe is more likely finite than eternal. So they have to demonstrate that their second premise of the common formulation, that whatever begins, or that the universe began to exist. And so I think that's the first stage. And the second stage is to say that a finite universe is more likely has a cause than is uncaused. So again, that's applying that causal principle to this cosmological fact that the universe began to exist. And then you get that the universe has a cause. And so then that's where we come to the third stage, where we say that the cause of the finite universe is more likely personal than impersonal. And then the fourth final stage is to say that a personal cause of the universe is more likely given theism than atheism.
And so which stage do you think is the most difficult to defend logically?
Absolutely, I think it's the fourth stage. Okay, so the stage that moves from a personal cause of the universe to God. So this omnipotent, morally perfect being who created the universe. So none of the premises that the Kalam appeals to have reference to any sort of moral properties. So this is what's often called in the literature the gap problem. There's this idea that the Kalam, even if we were to concede all the way up to the third stage, cannot in principle undercut the argument from evil or an argument from hiddenness. You could grant that the universe has a cause and that cause is personal, but you would just end up at deism. You wouldn't get this perfectly loving being who was moral, who cared about us, who responded to our religious concerns, was a fitting object of worship. That's, I think, by far the hardest step.
Matt, I know that you are not a scientist, but I know you've heard this argument presented quite often, so I won't like represent it. But what are your thoughts on the cosmological argument? And I know it's also been classically called the cosmological argument.
Cosmological arguments are an entire category of arguments, but the Kalam famously, for me, it cannot possibly be an argument for the existence of God because the word God, the term God, and the concept God appear nowhere in the Kalam. The entirety of the Kalam is everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. That is both premises and the conclusion of the Kalam. Everything else that gets from that conclusion to a God is something else that is being added to the Kalam. So A, God's not a part of the Kalam. You have to add something to it to get there. B, I don't know that premise one is necessarily true, although it may feel like that. I don't know how you demonstrate it. And premise two is also potentially questionable as to whether or not the universe had a beginning, because that gets to definitions. Because maybe the cosmos had no beginning, but our local presentation of the universe did, in which case it would still have a cause for it, but we know nothing about the cause. And the Kalam doesn't tell you anything about the cause in either. So.
More like it's more like at the fundamental level, what you have from physics, or you have differential equations, and that they just describe how things change, how states change. So there's not really like any causation going on. So this is on that end of the extreme. They would just say there's no cause there. We don't need that language. We can just talk about how states change according to these mathematical equations, and that's it.
Universe begins to exist. First of all, whether the universe begins or not, as we commented before, is not settled. So the universe may have a beginning. That's not necessarily the case, but let's just assume that the universe does have a beginning. What does that have to do with cause? Nothing. Cause and effect. Cause and effect is an emergent property. It's not a fundamental property, and so it's a mistake to associate an emergent property with the alleged beginning of the universe. So there's a misunderstanding of how cause and effect operates, or how it emerges, and therefore it's an inappropriate statement to associate that with beginning. So it's a non-starter. It doesn't get anywhere. That's not really surprising, again, because this is something that a person came up with, basically a philosopher, for 1,000 years in a pre-scientific era. So it's not really surprising. It seems reasonable given the time, but it's just not something that is compatible with our current understanding.
So the cosmological argument is a very interesting argument. I talk about it in my metaphysics course that I am redoing for the Great Courses. I had an audio-only version 10 years ago. They asked me to redo it, and so I'm recording a live in-person version on camera, which I've expanded to 30 lectures from 24. I've revised some of the lectures and that kind of stuff, including the one on the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument is an interesting argument. It does not get its name from the word cause, as in the cosmological argument, it's argument from cause, although some versions of the cosmological argument are known as the argument from cause. Cause in the cosmological argument, cosmos is referring to cosmos, which as in all of creation, all of the universe, all of the cosmos, right? All of the universe. And the idea is that, the basic idea behind the cosmological argument is the idea that we know that God exists because his existence is the best explanation for where the cosmos came from, right? So God is necessary to interject, to believe in to hypothesize as the existence of for the existence of the universe itself, because otherwise it couldn't be there. Like, why is there something rather than nothing? That kind of thing goes behind the cosmological argument. I mean, I could spend a lot of time talking about different versions of the cosmological argument. Aquinas's five ways, 3 of them are basically cosmological arguments. I'll get to the nitty gritty of different versions. Basically, there's kind of ones that you can do from causation or from explanation, which is related to necessity and possibility. So I'll talk about the causation ones first. So the causation versions of the argument just basically observe that there are causes and effects. Like there's an event that happens and it has a cause, and whatever caused it would have to have a cause as well. And that leads to this seeming regress that keeps going back, like A caused B and B caused C. I'm sorry, A was caused by B and B was caused by C and C was caused by D. Keep, on seemingly ad infinitum. But like, Aquinas argues, well, it can't go on forever, so it must have ended somewhere. There must be some kind of first uncaused causer, and that we know as God, Aquinas would say, right? Or you can term it in terms of explanation. This is basically Leibniz's version, where you have the principle of sufficient reason that says that nothing is unexplained, no fact is unexplained, nothing is true without there being an explanation for why that fact is true. And so there's that would seem to start this kind of seeming infinite regress of explanations, and it can't go on forever. Well, actually, technically, Leibniz might say that it either has to stop somewhere, or if it goes on forever, that infinite chain of explaining one contingent thing being explained by a next, that infinite chain itself would need some kind of explanation. And if that's just another contingent thing that explains that, then we just get the regress again. Somewhere there's got to be some kind of necessary self-explaining entity that is the explanation for the fact that there are contingent objects at all, that there are things that need explanations. And so that's that you can see a similar kind of structure to these arguments. There are a number of problems with them, like the causation argument. It's not true that everything has a cause. Quantum mechanics has told us that there are some things that happen without a cause. There is also the fact that, like, we know what started the universe, and it was a Big Bang. Interestingly, we actually know this because of the work of a Catholic priest who first hypothesized, Georges Lemaitre, who hypothesized the existence of a primordial atom, which eventually became the idea of, like, genesis of the idea for the singularity and that kind of stuff. And the singularity begins time, like time and space begin when the singularity explodes. And so it can't have a cause because nothing came before it, and causes must precede their effects, but nothing happened before the Big Bang. So it literally can't have a cause. And so there's problems that kind of come up with that, with the causal version of the argument. The explanatory version of the argument has similar problems, where the principle of sufficient reason isn't actually true. In fact, it refutes itself, because if every fact has an explanation, then that fact has an explanation. The fact that everything has an explanation would have to have an explanation. But what could the explanation be? I mean, it could be a fact that everything has an explanation, but that is a fact would just have to be the way things are. It just is the case that everything has an explanation, but there wouldn't be an explanation for the fact that everything has an explanation. And so, but even if we like sidestep that, where we say, oh, maybe not every fact needs an explanation, maybe just everything that exists needs an explanation or something like that. Even if we do that, we have the problem that, well, okay, even if that's the case, what it points to is a self-necessitating thing, something that is necessary but made itself necessary. It's either self-causing or self-necessitating or whatever. There's got to be something that sits at the end of that, of that sequence, as it were. But that could just as easily be the universe as it could be God, right? If there has to be some uncaused causer, some self-moved mover, some self-necessitating necessitator, some self-explaining explainer, whatever it is, that there's nothing in the argument that says that has to be God, rather than just the universe itself. And so it just kind of, all it does is gets us like, well, then maybe the universe is self-caused, right? It doesn't really get us to God. Aquinas tried to get that gap, to cover that gap by just kind of declaring things like, and that is what men talk about when they talk about God or whatever. But that's not really a good argument, right? And so this was actually recognized by Al-Ghazali. So now we're going into the Kalam cosmological argument, right?
Well, I mean, it's a valid argument, but then the question is, are the premises true? And I don't think Craig establishes any of the premises being true. Now, one thing that we've talked a lot about, the tense theory of time, and a little bit about whether the universe began to exist. I actually think that the more as sort of important as what we've just discussed is, the perhaps more interesting aspect, or at least increasingly what I'm finding more interesting, is whether the universe had a cause, or required a cause / had a cause. So that's obviously one of the premises, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, or at least if the universe began to exist, then it has a cause in the newer form. Mm-hmm. And this, I think, is really interesting because it leads us to think about the nature of causation. What does it mean for something to be a cause or have a cause? And also, suppose the universe did have a cause, what must that cause have been like, or what could that cause have been like? And I think that this is an aspect of the argument that is relatively underexplored. And one of the things I'm increasingly interested in doing is thinking about alternatives to God as a cause of the universe, because it's often just sort of, maybe not assumed, but is argued very sort of flippantly and I think insubstantively about why the cause of the universe has to be a personal God. Whereas I think there are actually lots and lots of options on the table, even if the universe did have a cause, and I don't think Craig establishes that. But supposing that it did, I don't think that you really get to, I mean, God is a possibility, but I don't actually think it's a very good, like a plausible explanation or possibility. And so I think that is perhaps one of the more interesting aspects of the argument.
So I would say the Big Bang didn't create anything. The Big Bang isn't a cause and effect kind of thing. I guess it kind of depends on what we mean by the Big Bang. If we mean the general theory, then this is a framework for understanding space-time, matter, and energy that simply cannot be extended beyond some point in time, which allows that point in time to be the beginning of time or not. And so those options are both open. And so, yeah, that's so in other words, I think it's a misconception to think of the Big Bang as a cause and effect kind of thing. A creation would be a cause and effect kind of thing.
When I have given this argument elsewhere, William Lane Craig has accused me of mistaking material causes for efficient causes. I don't think he even fully understands what those things are, but that is not what I'm doing. If you want more on that, I clarify that in great detail in my new great course, which will be coming out soon. But basically, the long and short of it is the problem is that the universe doesn't have a material cause. Like the law might be anything that has a material cause needs an efficient cause. The universe doesn't have a material cause because it wasn't made out of existing matter. And so the fact that things that have material cause need efficient causes, well, it doesn't follow that the universe needs an efficient cause because it wouldn't have a material cause because it wasn't constructed out of already existing matter, which that's what a material cause of something is. Anyway, I go into more detail of that in the course. The other problem is, and then I'll leave it with this, is that the only way, well, I'll just put it this way. Another big problem for the cosmological argument is that first premise is false. And anytime matter comes into existence, it needs an explanation or a cause. Quantum mechanics has told us that that's false. We know that matter can come into existence without an explanation, without a cause. And in fact, even large bits of matter, like as big as a universe, that is completely consistent with quantum mechanics of that kind of thing happening. And so technically speaking, that might get out of the begging the question problem, because the one and only time the universe came into existence wouldn't just be the universe coming into existence. It could happen within the universe itself. But solving the begging the question problem that way just completely refutes the argument, because it just shows that first premise is false, right? It's not the case that every time something comes into existence, it needs a cause, because quantum mechanics has actually shown us that that is not the case. So again, if that was too quick, too fast, I go over it in great detail in my my new metaphysics course with the great courses, which should be coming out hopefully in 2026. I'm recording in summer 2025.
All right. Okay. Am I swayed by philosophical arguments like Kalam cosmological argument? Yeah, I think that those are very helpful. My sort of favorite, I don't know if I have a favorite argument for God's existence, right? Probably the Kalam I think is pretty strong. There have been some challenges to it, of course, but I think by far most of those challenges don't really hold well. And I can't think of any specific one that does hold well against it right now. But yeah, those things, those arguments, I think, do work well. And what happens is oftentimes what I see with atheists in my debates with them, discussions with them, whether it's online or with friends of mine who are atheists or family members who are atheists, is that there is this sort of mindset where if I cannot prove absolutely sure to the satisfaction of the person with whom I'm speaking that there can be no wiggle room or escape, I have absolutely failed and have not demonstrated that God exists. And we don't have that sort of standard for just about anything else, certainly not within science. Science, that is not how it works. That if you cannot prove wrong every single supposition or possibility outside of it, therefore the theory is completely debunked because it cannot absolutely answer absolutely everything. I mean, like, general relativity does not answer absolutely every objection that comes across against it. That doesn't mean we therefore just throw it out the window. So yeah.
Much of this has to do with okay, let me put it this way. My background is science, and therefore my interests are how you can best explain, model the world successfully. And the kind of job we do in certain areas of science, more mature areas of science like physics, which I'm in, they tend to be pretty compelling. And so because of the overall way things like the structure of physics hangs together, that it does a good job in explaining and predicting things and so forth, we tend to think that, okay, we've got a handle on at least some parts of the world this way. Now, of course, if you're going to ask, does that necessarily mean that it's true? You're opening up a can of philosophical worms that's been with us for thousands of years and probably will be always. But if you think of starting from the everyday pragmatic sense of true, is it true that it's raining out there? Is it true that today is Friday type of question? I think the kind of truth that is so compelling in some of our sciences connects pretty well to that pragmatic sense of truth. So I'm certainly obviously willing to go with that. I think of the Kalam cosmological argument. Okay, now most of your listeners would run into the Kalam cosmological argument in its rather sort of Christianized version, presumably the version of, say, William Lane Craig and so forth. That's what we're talking about. The connection of that to Islamic philosophy is real but somewhat tenuous. In the Muslim tradition, the philosophical theology as it's been done in the Christian tradition isn't really quite as central. So you will not, for example, see a lot of talk amongst Muslims about, say, cosmological arguments of any sort. Kalam in the Islamic theological tradition is considered to be a fairly minor, sometimes even dubious enterprise, where the more reputable type of religious knowledge is, say, scriptural knowledge or knowledge of law, knowledge of the traditions that trace back to Muhammad and that type of thing. So the Islamic intellectual tradition tends to be much more pragmatically oriented that way. Now, if you're talking about the Kalam argument as it has recently been promoted by certain Christian apologists, I don't think much of it, no, but reasons are twofold. One is this is a sort of an argument that tries to make some connections to real world facts and things like that, such as the Big Bang cosmology and everything like that. Now, so my inclination, therefore, because my background is that of a physicist rather than, say, a philosopher of religion, the immediate way I tend to interpret something like a Kalam argument is to say, oh, does this actually make sense in the context of physical cosmology? Does this actually, as an argument, help me at all in advancing, say, physics? Because my concerns are going to be that rather than, say, the traditional religious debate. And when I look at it that way, no, it's useless. The whole insistence that, say, not only is the universe finite in time, but it's somehow that is necessary that because of reasons that, say, for example, Craig makes a lot of, as in he has a problem with infinities and things like that. I mean, if you're a physicist, you're just used to infinity as yet one more mathematical object. It's no more crazy than zero as a mathematical object. So a lot of the time, some aspects of the Kalam argument really don't seem to the point at all that way. So I come to it, therefore, with a kind of a suspicion because of my physics background rather than my philosophy of religion background. And then there are also aspects of this which are really strange, because there's the inference that because something has a beginning, therefore something has to have a cause. And that's rather odd in a physical cosmological context as well. Because if you're doing physics in a grand sweep, which you kind of have to when you're doing cosmology, that changes your perspective on causes and causation. Now, in the philosophical tradition, in the metaphysical philosophical tradition, which still is very much alive and well in the philosophy of religion, there is a tendency since ancient times to think of causality as a sort of a fundamental metaphysical aspect of existence, and therefore arguments like everything has to have a cause and so forth has a certain amount of plausibility. But if you're talking about causality in a physics sense, no, it doesn't work that way. The sort of everyday notions of cause and effects are nice enough when you're talking about, say, the physics that you use to describe everyday phenomena. Causality also, interestingly enough, is very much sort of a social concept. So it refers to causality and responsibility and so forth in the context of intelligent social animals. But there's lots of areas of physics where causality in the everyday sense is not at all a useful concept. Nobody messes around with causality, worries about causality, say, for example, if you're doing quantum physics, because quantum physics can only predict probability distributions, and pretty much everything is random fundamentally. So where's causality in that? And if you're now going to a cosmological context, then you say, okay, the universe popped into existence. Okay, fine. That sort of thing is not really conceptually all that alien to the rest of physics. It's just something that we'll roll with. And finally, perhaps, even if you were to say somehow decide that you're going to stick with the metaphysical tradition, you're going to say causality is going to have to be something fundamental, and you decide that the universe therefore has to have a cause, I don't see how the whole religion business comes into this. In that, okay, maybe you're talking about something has to have a cause. How do you bring in the whole sort of Baroque superstructure of the sort of Abrahamic God and things like that? That strikes me as being a huge leap. And again, that's partially because of my personal background. I did not grow up religious and things like that. So that's not immediately something I jump to. While somebody who grew up in a religious culture is probably going to be much more easily reaching for saying, oh, that's obviously the sort of God of my tradition and everything like that. But if somebody's trying to make an argument to people who are outside of their particular religious tradition, I would think that you would need something a little bit more solid than saying, hey, there's a cause out there.
Al-Ghazali, an Islamic scholar, recognized this problem with the cosmological arguments, that they point to some kind of necessary being, but the necessary being could just as easily be the universe's God. And so what we needed, Al-Ghazali argued, was some reason to think that the universe couldn't be the self-necessitating necessitator. It couldn't be this ultimate being to which the cosmological arguments, the other cosmological arguments pointed, but God could. So we need to find some kind of, we can't just say, well, you know, God doesn't need one, but the universe does. Like, we can't just say that. We have to have a reason for thinking that God wouldn't need an explanation, but the universe would, or God wouldn't need a cause, but the universe would. And so he presented what is now known as the Kalam cosmological argument. Kalam was his school of thought in Islamic thought. That's why it's called that. And he was responding to other people in the Falasifa, I believe, who had given these other cosmological arguments, and he realized that they were faulty for the reasons I just pointed out. And so he argues that, well, I mean, basically what he argues is that the difference between the universe and God, and so why God doesn't need a cause or an explanation, but the universe does, is that the universe began to exist, but God did not. And so God could be a self-necessitating necessitator, but the universe can't, right? Now, interestingly, one of the most ingenious parts of his argument was an argument that showed that the universe must have a beginning. At the time, people didn't know whether the universe had a beginning. For all they knew, it was actually infinite. And he kind of gives this interesting argument based on the fact that you can't traverse infinities for thinking that the universe actually had a beginning. And basically, the idea is if it didn't have a beginning, then there's an infinite time between now and the past. And that means an infinite number of moments in time have passed to get us to now, but you can't traverse an infinity. So there must have been a starting point. At least that's the basic idea of his argument that the universe had a beginning. But of course, you know, Lemaitre and science since then has proved that, you know, looks like our universe did have a beginning. And so that, you know, premise is on pretty solid ground. And so from there, we get an argument that basically just goes like, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause, right? But God didn't begin to exist, so he wouldn't need a cause, so God could be the ultimate being, but the universe couldn't be. So interestingly, I think that the Kalam cosmological argument would actually be better if instead of talking about causes, it talked about explanations. Said anything that began to exist would need an explanation, and then the universe began to exist, so the universe would need an explanation, and then God wouldn't need one. Because when you put it in terms of cause, the universe, like I pointed out before, can't have a cause because it starts time, so something can't come before it, and causes must precede their effects. So there's like an intrinsic problem with the Kalam cosmological argument when it is expressed in terms of causation, which is what Al-Ghazali did, and that's also what modern defenders of the Kalam cosmological argument do, is they term it in terms of causation. And so I actually think that's a weaker version of the argument because it's subject to that conclusion. I usually like to think of it in terms of explanation. I think the argument is stronger that way. However, I have argued that in public. I've argued against the explanation version, and I've been accused of people like by William Lane Craig of straw manning the argument or mistaking it for Leibniz's argument because I'm terming it in terms of explanation rather than causation, because Leibniz's argument is more about causation. I'm not doing that. I understand the difference. I think the argument is better when it is termed in terms of explanation. However, to circumvent that problem, I'll talk about it in terms of causation, which is what I do in my lecture series, in the new revised version of my lecture series. So even if we sidestep the problem that if the universe can't have a cause because the Big Bang starts time and space, and so nothing can come before it. There's a problem here, and the problem is that the argument, as stated, equivocates. Again, the argument is everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And what it equivocates on is that phrase began to exist. All right. So when it gives evidence for that first premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause. What it does is it mentions everyday objects, right? The book began to exist. It has a cause. right? The pencil began to exist. It has a cause. And blah, 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 the table and the chair and blah, 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 and points to things in the world and says these things began to exist. And obviously they have a cause. And so that's really good evidence for thinking that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? Is it deductive proof? No, but it's, pretty good evidence. That's the idea, right? And I'm not even going to bother with the fact that it's not deductive proof, right? That's good enough. It's good enough reason to think that everything has a cause in the sense that these things began to exist. Here's the problem. When ordinary objects, like books and pencils, come into existence, they're not spawned out of nothing, right? The matter that makes up those objects already existed before the book existed. The book comes into existence when we arrange that matter that pre-existed the book in a particular way and configure it, and now we have a new object, the book, right? The most obvious example, the easiest example I use for this is the Lego Millennium Falcon that's sitting in my basement right now, right? It used to be a collection of 8,000 pieces. Over 9 months, my son and I put it together. Now it is a Millennium Falcon. All the pieces pre-existed the Falcon. The Falcon came into existence at a particular time, right? Well, not at a particular moment because it took a while to put it together, but you know what I'm getting at here, right? Like there was a moment in time at which the Falcon did not exist, and yet all the pieces that made it up did. We brought the Falcon into existence by taking already existing matter and arranging it in such a way that a new object came to be, right? And that is true for all material objects in the universe. Even stars and planets came into existence when already existing matter came to be formed in a new kind of way. So even when we don't do it, that's what it means for an object to become into existence, right? So if the phrase began to exist, if that's what we're talking about, if that's what it means in that first premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause. If that's what that means, then that statement is true. We got good evidence for it. All material objects in the world, fine. The problem is that when we go to that second premise, well, the universe began to exist. The universe did not begin to exist in the same way that all the other objects did. It did not begin to exist by already existing material coming to be arranged in a new way that it wasn't before. When the universe came into existence, it began to exist by matter itself coming into existence, right? And so the first premise, as stated, is about matter arrangement. The second premise is about matter generation, we might say, matter coming into existence. And so the two premises are not actually about the same thing. They both have the phrase began to exist in them, but they're actually about two different kinds of existence or coming into existence. And so the argument equivocates. It looks like it's valid because it's like everything that began to exist has a cause. X began to exist, so X has a cause. But it equivocates because it's using that same phrase in different ways. To illustrate the problem, I like to use this example. I even forget where I got it. I stole this from some logic textbook somewhere, and I don't remember where it came from. But I love this argument. Bologna's better than nothing. Nothing's better than prime rib. Therefore, bologna's better than prime rib. Right? Now that sounds valid, right? X is better than nothing. Or X is better than Y. Y is better than Z. So X is better than Z. Like that sounds like it works. But the word nothing is used in two different ways in the two different premises. Bologna's better than nothing. Nothing's better than prime rib. The word nothing's being used in two different ways there. So obviously the argument doesn't work, right? And when we disambiguate the argument, it becomes clear. Having bologna to eat is better than having nothing to eat at all. There is no particular kind of food that's better than prime rib. Therefore, bologna's better than prime rib. Obviously, that doesn't follow, right? Once we disambiguate the phrase, the problem becomes obvious. With the Kalam cosmological argument, what the first premise means is when already existing matter comes to be arranged in a new way such that we would call it an object, the arrangement of that matter needs an explanation for how it came to be arranged. There's a cause, as it were, for how that matter came to be arranged that way. Okay, there's your first premise. Second premise, when the matter of the universe came into existence, there must have been a cause for it. We're talking about something totally different now. We're not talking about matter arrangement anymore. And so the argument equivocates. Okay? Now, that said, we can try to fix the argument, right? If it equivocates, well, let's make it not equivocate anymore. Let's change the meaning of began to exist in that first premise so that it means the same thing as what it does in the second premise, right? So to do what that argument would look like then is we would say, anytime matter comes into existence, there is a cause for the fact that it came into existence, right? The matter of the universe came into existence. Therefore, the event of the matter of the universe coming to existence needs a cause, right? Great. That argument doesn't equivocate. So we're out of that problem. But now we've created a new one. Now the argument just begs the question. Because that first premise is, anytime matter comes into existence, there needs to be a cause for that matter coming into existence. Well, the one and only time matter came into existence is when the universe came into existence. And so the only way that you would accept that first premise is if you already accepted the conclusion that when the matter of the universe came into existence, it had a cause for coming into existence, right? Because that's the one and only time that that happened. So in order for you to believe that first premise, you'd already have to accept the conclusion.
The colors in the flower evolved in order to attract insects to pollinate it is interesting. It means that insects can see the color. It adds a question. Does this aesthetic sense also exist in the lower forms? Why is it aesthetic? All kinds of interesting questions which the science knowledge only adds to the excitement, the mystery, and the awe of a flower. It only adds. I don't understand how it subtracts.
I should like to say two things. One intellectual and one moral. The intellectual thing I should want to say to them is this. When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or by what you think could have beneficent social effects if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts. That is the intellectual thing that I should wish to say. The moral thing I should wish to say to them is very simple. I should say, love is wise, hatred is foolish. In this world, which is getting more and more closely interconnected, we have to learn to tolerate each other. We have to learn to put up with the fact that some people say things that we don't like. We can only live together in that way. If we are to live together and not die together, we must learn a kind of charity and a kind of tolerance, which is absolutely vital to the continuation of human life on this planet.
The equation E is equal mc squared.
Some part of our being knows this is where we came. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along.